And I think the palace, by behaving in this way, it did allow Epstein to get away with abusing girls for, I think, 3 or 4 more years. Absolutely, they have blood on their hands.
Tell us about the reaction to your book and maybe give us an idea of some of the things that people have been telling you since that might go in the paperback. What kind of things have come to your attention in the last few weeks that you wish you'd known before you'd published?
Well, I've already got about 20 pages of notes from the people who've come forward. So lots of stories about Andrew's bisexuality. There have been more stories about Fergie getting freebies, not paying bills. There have been more stories about Andrew as special representative and silly things that he did and how counterproductive he was. Him being caught with women in places like Mongolia, activities in places like Libya. Um, a lot of how unpopular he was in the Navy, how badly behaved he was. Um, I give him the benefit of the doubt in the Falklands and say that he served pretty honourably and did his bit, but a lot of people have come forward and said he was protected there. So I will have to revise and look back over things and perhaps re-interview people just to try and understand better what was going on. And these are not minor figures or people, they're sort of quite senior people, including someone who was asked to be his private secretary, a member of one of the best, London clubs. So, and these are people volunteering. It's not as if I've come after them. One of the other things is a lot of people who weren't prepared to be on the record for the book are now prepared to be on the record for the paperback, which is helpful. I think they didn't realize how many people had gone on the record. And I think also now that they see just this stuff that other people are saying, I think they feel more comfortable with what they were saying. People, I think, are always careful. But some people have suffered. I know that some people have in the Navy, there's a strong omerta that you sort of protect your own. And some people have suffered for speaking out publicly. A number of diplomats that I'd hoped would talk to me are still refusing to talk to me when I would have hoped that they might reconsider and perhaps look at their conscience and see that they're covering him up. And I suppose one of the other consequences from the book is there are more and more people in the media talking about the need for some sort of, I wouldn't say commission, but parliamentary inquiry into the royals, their transparency, the accountability, what Andrew was up to and as a special representative, their finances. So I sort of feel the dial has slightly changed, and possibly when Giuffre's book comes out, that will change things too. I personally think there's a good chance that more Epstein material will be released. I mean, we've only seen, I think, only 3% of the material that's come out is new, and it's pretty innocent. But if the victims start naming people on the floor of the Capitol, then I think there will be forced to be some sort of reaction. I mean, the line is that Trump will eventually release something with all the Republican names taken out. But even if we just get Democratic names, I mean, that will be something. It will just show that this is a bigger story than everyone realized. It's much more connected. And I'm hoping that maybe some people will talk about Andrew who've perhaps not felt they could talk about Andrew. At the moment, the only accusation against him really is Virginia Giuffre. I mean, there are one or two other people I mentioned. There's one called Sarah. But otherwise, what we need is someone who's had dealings with them to come out and talk. There's a woman called Tiffany Doe who I talk about in the book, who was employed to entertain him. But her problem is she's slightly compromised because she was sort of employed by Epstein. And I think she's nervous about talking. But I think, again, what's interesting in the book is a number of people who pled the Fifth Amendment when they were asked about their dealings with Andrew. I think Sarah Kellen and Adriana Ross and others, and indeed Epstein himself. And of course, there are plenty of testimony of people seeing Andrew on the island in Palm Beach with youngish girls. And there's a story I'm just trying to chase down now about teenage girls in Kazakhstan that he was involved with.
Okay, let's go right back to the beginning. Tell us the story of how Prince Andrew and Epstein became friends. You mentioned in the book there's a discrepancy in this timeline. Explain that discrepancy. Talk about why you think that Andrew did lie about that, and just give us an idea of how this friendship began and when.
Well, Andrew always claimed in the Newsnight interview the relationship began in the late 1990s. But his own private secretary, Alistair Watson, wrote to the Times and said that it was beginning of the 1990s. And Steve Hoffenberg, who was actually part of a Ponzi scheme with Epstein and went to prison, says it was, I think, in 1991. And we don't have much material between 1991 and 1999 on Andrew and Epstein. Andrew was in the Navy at the time. He was often at sea or on military bases, but he did have long holidays. He was involved, for example, I discovered in Kazakhstan at that time doing business. And he was going around the world having a good time. So the relationship begins much earlier. We now know from recent disclosures, from legal depositions, and from leaked emails that the relationship went on after 2010, when he claimed it ended, at least until 2015. How they met, I think, is still a bit of a mystery. What Ghislaine Maxwell said when she was interviewed the other day was that it was Fergie who introduced Andrew to Epstein. Um, and Fergie had met Epstein through sort of New York social circles. And that has a ring of truth about it. One of the people I interviewed, who's a close friend of Ghislaine, said that the relationship went back between Andrew and Epstein to the 1980s. Sorry, between Ghislaine and Andrew went back to the 1980s, and it was through Ghislaine that he met Epstein. And since Ghislaine, after her father died, came to New York, that would be, again, a possible route. But, we just don't know. I mean, clearly Andrew hasn't told the truth in his interviews. We can't ask Epstein. And maybe, Maxwell will say some more, or other people will come forward. There must be sightings of them together. There must be pictures of them together doing things.
And tell us more about Sarah Ferguson's relationship with Epstein, and what revelations were in your book that haven't been previously reported. Because it seems to me that one of the interesting things about your book is that it does shine a light on Sarah Ferguson's relationship with Epstein that we didn't really know about before. So just give us an idea of what you uncovered there and what you think that implies.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting, the Sarah Ferguson relationship with Epstein, because everything's been focused on Andrew and Epstein, but she had more numbers in the Little Black Book than Andrew. We know, stayed at Palm Beach. We know she stayed in Manhattan. And one of the things I discovered, which is going to the paperback, is that she was staying, having said that she had done nothing more to do with Epstein, she was staying with Epstein 5 years after that, in 2015. So, she needs to come slightly clean on exactly what the relationship was. I mean, clearly it was to pay her bills that was one of the reasons Andrew became friendly with her. I think one of the other interesting areas is that there are some of Andrew's girlfriends who were on the Lolita Express. And in fact, I then discovered were also involved with Trump. So Andrew seemed to introduce some of his own girlfriends to Epstein, and Epstein used them possibly as bait for people, or indeed, flew them out to the island and they had relationships or whatever it is they did. I've approached one of these women, in fact, last week. I mean, clearly she's not talking. None of her friends are talking. But she is on several flights, and she's not a name that's been mentioned before. Um, so I think there's still a lot still to come out, but whether all the files have been destroyed, whether anyone who knows is going to talk is another matter. But yeah, Sarah Ferguson, I think, should be interviewed by the authorities. I think she's a material witness and has a lot to add to the story.
And another thing that's kind of interesting in your book is you give some idea of the scale of witnesses to Andrew's behavior within Epstein's circle. So it's not just Virginia Giuffre. There's other people that you quote there too. So for example, you've got Epstein's driver, you've got the housekeeper, and then you also kind of quote various testimony from other witnesses as well. So for example, you talk about Virginia Giuffre alleging that Andrew lobbied on behalf of Epstein to try and get him a lower sentence around the same time that Sarah Ferguson was getting her debts paid off. So can you just give us an idea of the kind of scale of witness testimony there is about Andrew that goes beyond the general narrative? Because I think for most of the general public, they just kind of think Virginia Giuffre, that's that. But actually, it's much, much bigger than that, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, there are many witnesses to seeing, for example, Andrew at Tramp. There's a woman called Shukri Andrew Wall, Shukri Walker. Um, there's people who saw the photograph with him in Virginia soon after it was taken, including her father, her ex-boyfriend, another victim called Caroline Andriamo. So, I mean, there are plenty of people around. I mean, the line is, oh, it's only Virginia Giuffre. But there are people who saw them on the island. There's a man called Steve Scully who did the IT there. There's one called Denise George, who was Attorney General of the Virgin Islands, who has testimony from people. I think Steve Hoffenberg talks about them. So, I mean, there is a lot out there. And also, what Laura Burns, who was the investigator for Panorama, which is the precursor to the Newsnight program, I mean, she found emails between Ghislaine and Andrew talking about Virginia Giuffre and how they would deal with her. So this idea that he'd never met her, didn't know who she was, etc., is ridiculous. In fact, there's even a PR firm was brought in later to try and discredit Giuffre, and in fact, I think that's still going on now. So they clearly felt the story needed to be shut down. And I think one of the revealing things is that Amy Robach, who was a presenter at ABC Television, was actually who again found information, interviewed Giuffre, and had the whole story of Andrew's relationship with Giuffre. When she tried to present this story to her bosses, they said they put it to the palace, and the palace said, "You've got a choice. If you run the story, we'll never deal with you again." And that happened, there were other occasions. I mean, we feel the BBC was brave to run that Newsnight interview, but actually, poor old the Panorama team in Ireland, at times the BBC wanted to shut down this investigation and didn't want to go there. It was kind of left to this little maverick team in Ireland to do that rather than any of the sort of flagship programs in London. So, I mean, there was nervousness about covering this then, and I think there's been nervousness since. So, you asked about the reaction. I mean, there's two big papers, three big papers I can think of, who interviewed me and then decided for legal reasons not to run the articles. And those are the ones that actually already interviewed me. How many didn't interview me and decided not to cover the story? And is that from pressure from the palace or people just being nervous?
It's interesting you bring up Amy Robach because I think it's actually worth quoting her in this interview. So she said, for example, Virginia told me everything. She had pictures, she had everything. She was in hiding for 12 years. We convinced her to come out. We convinced her to talk to us. It was unbelievable what we had. Clinton, we had everything. I tried for 3 years to get it on to no avail. The palace found out we had her whole allegations about Prince Andrew and threatened us in a million different ways. It's hard not to come to the conclusion that the palace prolonged the abuse of Epstein's victims by using their power to shut down a story. What's your take on that?
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the palace, by behaving in this way, did allow Epstein to get away with abusing girls for, I think, 3 or 4 more years. Absolutely, they have blood on their hands. I don't think it's going to worry them too much. But it just shows that, the pressure and that was the pressure we know about, how much pressure was put on behind the scenes. For example, The Sun have not run a single article about my book. You would have thought it's obvious tabloid fodder for them. The only piece they've run in the last few weeks is a puff piece on Sarah Ferguson. And you've then got to ask questions, what was the relationship between Sarah Ferguson and The Sun? Going back, I've been told that I can, by some papers, we don't mind, criticizing Andrew, but don't criticize Sarah Ferguson. So again, what was Sarah Ferguson's relationship with those papers that they don't want to criticize her? Was she, as members of the royal family, suspected? And one of the reasons why they kind of cold-shouldered her, were they suspicious that she was leaking stories to the press? This is maybe something she will address in her forthcoming memoir, or not.
Do you think Andrew was being blackmailed? Or do you think he was almost a kind of proxy blackmail against the entire royal family?
I think the suspicion must be that Andrew was being blackmailed. I mean, there was a lot of compromising material that was collected by Epstein, was collected by foreign intelligence agencies and even governments. And it would be very surprising if they collected this material, they didn't try and use it in some way. How he was blackmailed, I don't know. And it may be that some of the stuff will eventually be leaked at some point. We'll suddenly see it on the internet. But yeah, he placed himself in a very vulnerable position and very foolishly. And it would be very surprising if having collected this material, it wasn't being used. So yeah, I mean, one can only guess how he was played. You're absolutely right too about, I mean, Epstein thought that he could get through Andrew to the Queen, he could help her with investments. There are actually mentions from David Rowlands, who was one of Andrew's financial sort of advisors, that he was actually operating with King Charles. So it does suggest that there were others involved with Andrew in the royal family who were getting the benefit from either Epstein or the Rowlands.
Another thing you talk about in the book, you mentioned that Private Eye revealed that three officials went to the palace and received curt responses. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's interesting that Private Eye did have a piece saying that people had complained to the Queen and she treated them in a very curt manner and said, "Thank you for telling me," and nothing happened. And that certainly backs up what I had. I mean, I've got several stories of people going to private secretaries, whether they're top diplomats, spooks, all sorts of people, and basically told the Queen doesn't want to know about this. And Private Eye do have good connections with the palace. They clearly have a very good mall there. I just know from stuff I've seen. So this suggests that people have just given up trying to do anything. The Queen clearly had this complete blind spot with her son, and it kind of does change one's view of her because we always assume that she would put the institution ahead of her own family. But here is a case of her not doing that. And I mean, the fact is, she did publicly support him, which made people think that perhaps he was innocent. She would have him sit beside her on the way to church. He escorted her to her seat at Philip's memorial service. She continued to heap honors on him. He continued to go to the Knight of the Garter's lunches and stuff. And no one took away any of his titles. And I think the big question now is, will those titles be removed? Will do the public really want to have something more happen to him, that they don't feel he's actually really paid any real penalties for his behavior? He still lives in Royal Lodge. He still has a pretty extravagant lifestyle. Okay, he's lost his royal status, but I mean, he's still Duke of York. He's still welcomed in the bosom of the family. They're all up at Balmoral now. Has he actually really paid any penalty for his behavior? And the worry must be that if some of these victims come forward with the stories that they may have, and I think one of the most revealing things was the American politician Nancy Grace coming out of a meeting and saying this guy should be in handcuffs. So what did they tell her that makes her think that?
And tell us about the relationship between Andrew and Trump, because Trump's obviously denied knowing him. There's photographic evidence to prove that's incorrect. What did you uncover about that relationship?
Well, the relationship between Andrew and Trump is very close. Andrew was used by Trump. They're all part of this network with Epstein. Andrew went to Mar-a-Lago. I mean, they had the same interests in money, golf, and women. I've got conversations in the book of overheard by diplomats of Andrew and Trump discussing, for example, masseurs and sex and women when they were and discussing Trump's golf course in Scotland. So they were big mates. I mean, they were both, I would say, rather coarse men who enjoyed locker room gossip, and that's certainly what the diplomat heard.
There's a probably apocryphal story that the Queen travelled everywhere with her own Lucy's in case nature called. For Andrew, he never seems to have gone anywhere without his masseuse table. Do you think that this was basically cover for him to hire prostitutes wherever he went, under the guise of hiring masseuses?
Yes, I mean the massage table is very amusing. I mean that and having his valet to with the ironing board to iron his trousers. I mean, certainly he went and stayed in hotels rather than with the ambassador, which gave him clearly freedom to meet women and to meet indeed other businessmen that weren't perhaps on the itinerary. And one of my favorite stories in the book is the woman who complimented him on his surfboard when she saw the ironing board or masseur's table. Um, but yes, absolutely. I mean, he's always assumed that there was a happy ending when he was getting a massage, even with quite reputable masseurs from, for example, sports clubs and things. And he would turn up in his dressing gown, and they would be slightly shocked, and he would, suggest ask for other things. So, and he now gets masseurs sent in to him in Royal Lodge, and I understand that those have happy endings. So, yeah, I mean it's and very similar to, of course, Epstein, who liked his massages. So, all these claims of having a dicky knee or whatever it was, I think are ridiculous. I mean, you've got to remember Ron Ferguson was also a habitué of massage parlors. And Andrew, according to one of my sources, was taken to a brothel, as a young boy. I mean, he's always, in a sense, known prostitutes. I think one of the shocking things is he just books them even when he's on official tours and he's covered up. And diplomats have lots of stories of being asked to provide a woman for him on these trips.
So Jean-Luc Brunel was a model scout accused of sourcing girls for Epstein, including two young girls he supposedly gave him for his birthday. He also killed himself in prison while awaiting trial for the rape of minors. You mentioned in the book that the French police wanted to interview Andrew too, in regard to the Jean-Luc Brunel case. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, again, Andrew would be a material witness. He often went to Paris. He often stayed. I think Epstein had a flat there that he used. And we've had Epstein's butler actually come and give an interview recently to the Telegraph. And I'm hoping to talk to him. He's very loyal still to Epstein. He didn't give away too much. But yeah, I mean, the line is that Brunel was supplying the girls, mainly from Eastern Europe. Many of whom didn't speak English, to the island, as part of this sort of sex trafficking that went on. Again, slightly mysterious death in prison, a suicide. Actually, I think on Andrew's birthday, by coincidence. But yeah, there are people. There's a big case, I think, against Brunel. There's one called Lisa Brinkworth who's done quite a lot of research into this. And I'm hoping that if I think she's going to write a book on it, that there may be new revelations and new connections between Brunel and Andrew, when that book comes out. So yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, we've got bits of the puzzle, but there's still huge gaps. But it is all part, I think, of one big puzzle.
And one of the things you also write about in the book, and I don't think this had been written about before, just talk about Laura Burns and Panorama, and let's give them the full credit that they're due. So just take us through kind of briefly that story, how this came about, and how Newsnight ended up basically taking the credit for that.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I thought one of the biggest stories I had in the book was the fact that the whole story around Newsnight and their interview, on which people like Only Mateless and Sam McAllister wrote books and had TV films made, is actually not the truth. And the truth is, and it's been suppressed, the real story. The truth is that the investigation into Andrew was being conducted by a Panorama team in Northern Ireland. The producer was a woman called Laura Burns. It was run by a man called Andrew Head, with a man called Dara McIntyre also working with her, and I think a woman called Gabrielle Dini. And they went out around the States interviewing victims, following stories, interviewing Virginia Giuffre. And they had a huge program that they wanted to transmit. And they went to the palace in August of 2019, and said, we want to give you a right of reply. The Palace, who had been talking to Newsnight about a very different program about Pitch at the Palace, which was a charitable enterprise that Andrew ran, um, uh, then found themselves a beneficiary of basically a change of focus. Now, whether the Palace then said that we don't want to talk to Panorama, but they said to the BBC, we'll talk to Newsnight. Or whether someone at Newsnight decided to pass everything across to someone called Esme Wren, who seems to be a crucial figure. Whether all the material from Panorama was passed to Newsnight at the behest of someone senior in the BBC, I just don't know, and I don't think Laura Burns knows. But the result was all her research was passed to Newsnight. They didn't know about this until 72 hours before the interview. So this idea that they've been sort of working on the palace for months is not correct. And I think one of the sad things is that though Emily Maitlis did a great job, she didn't ask many of the questions I think that the Panorama team wanted to ask. And in some ways, Andrew did get a slightly softer interview than, I mean, it's maybe hard to believe now, but only because Andrew behaved so stupidly in the interview. But he had a slightly easier ride with Newsnight than he would have had from Panorama. But poor old Laura Burns and her team were completely written out of the script, not mentioned at all. When there were BAFTA awards going, she was never mentioned. And she actually left television in disgust and now works in a completely different industry.
And what is the role of Robert Maxwell in all of this? Is there any notion that he was a blackmailer? and that Epstein took on that role after his death. So it's been reported, for example, that Robert Maxwell knew Epstein before Ghislaine, though this has been denied by Ghislaine and her family. Did you have any did you uncover anything about this side of things?
I mean, I didn't uncover much myself because clearly my focus has always been on Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. But there are books and research and things I've seen suggesting that Maxwell basically sprinted his money out of Britain. It disappeared, and this was basically passed to Jeffrey Epstein, who had these skills in sort of losing money in various offshore accounts. And of course, Ghislaine then was united with Epstein when her father died, and they became friends quite soon afterwards. And that's why Epstein was so good to Ghislaine, giving her millions of pounds and putting her up and briefly having some sort of romantic relationship with her. So I think Epstein, you're absolutely right, took on the role of Maxwell. We knew Maxwell had close links with various intelligence agencies, particularly Mossad, which Epstein seems to have also had. The ridiculous thing is with Epstein, he was a failed secondary school teacher who'd been sacked from Bear Stearns, suddenly was given huge sums of money and the largest townhouse in Manhattan by people like Lex Wexner, and for no apparent reason, and there's been never any explanation. He says he was a bounty hunter and various things, but it's very opaque. How he made these huge sums of money and why people like Lex Wexner gave him, for example, power of attorney. These networks, Maxwell, Epstein, Trump, Andrew. I mean, there are lots and lots of connections, and the same names keep coming up with all the investigations. Were names which I hope may well emerge if these Epstein files are released.
Did you get the idea that there was a state or state collaborating with Epstein? So if we know, for example, that Saudi Arabia tried to blackmail Jeff Bezos because he bravely released the intimate photos himself to kill that blackmail attempt. Did you get any idea that there was state backing for Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, I mean, I think there was state backing for Jeffrey Epstein because he had a Saudi passport under another name. Yes, and he clearly had very close links with Mossad. I mean, the number of the people, the names that keep popping up, Barak is one of the most recent, all had connections either with Israeli state or with Mossad. And Ben Arashi, I think, has talked about this whole story, actually. I mean, the links with Maxwell and Mossad. So yes, I mean, I think whether he was on the books or whether he was a freelance operator playing everyone off against each other, I think is again a mute question. Probably the latter. But in my book, and I think we took quite a lot of the stuff out, unfortunately. But he has close links with intelligence services in the Middle East and Libya, and clearly there are a lot of spies operating around, particularly around Andrew. I mean, I talk about a Russian spy and a Chinese spy, and everyone's got very exercised by Ten Bo, who they allege is a spy. But there are plenty of people, and of course it'd be natural. Andrew was very naive in the way he operated, had very little sense of his own security. He was very vulnerable because of his tastes and his greed. And of course, intelligence agencies would have circulated around him, thinking that he was, as you suggest, a good way into the royal family, good way of picking up information. And who knows what's been going on behind the scenes? Maybe the pressure's been put on the British government, saying, unless you give us whatever we want, we will release this rather incriminating information which will rot the monarchy. Who knows what's gone on? I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be information that Andrews could provide.
And do you think that we're being a bit too generous with Andrew by saying he's naive? I mean, it could also be the case that with these various, with Ten Bow, for example, that Andrew knew exactly what he was doing and that he was getting information to order, really, because the sort of things that Andrew would hear at a dinner party from kind of top colonels or top, the kind of people he would be around even now, he could find out things that would be hugely valuable to foreign states that have influence operations going on with him. So Andrew knows he's getting paid vast sums of money in some of these kinds of deals that, some of which you talk about in the book. Is it possible that he's a knowing traitor, basically, like his great uncle.
Well, I mean, it's been suggested, I've heard it, and I've heard it also suggested about Sarah Ferguson, that, I mean, quite what she would be able to tell me when I just don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think, he's got to be very naive not to realize these people are around. And I mean, there were people who were advising him. So, for example, Dominic Hampshire is an ex-army officer, experienced man of business, and he was his sort of point man with Tenbo. Why didn't Dominic Hampshire warn him? Why wasn't any due diligence done? Why didn't the intelligence services warn him? Possibly they did. And he ignored those warnings. I mean, you're absolutely right to make the connection with his great uncle. The line always was he was naive and played. But I think the reality is that Windsor knew exactly what he was doing and was quite happy to do it. And maybe Andrew falls into that category. It's difficult without having more testimony, but it does seem strange to go to places like Kazakhstan to do the sort of business he was doing, to be photographed as almost every businessman is in Kazakhstan who gets involved with prostitutes, and not to realize that he was making himself vulnerable, and maybe to accept that that was the price to be paid. Maybe he was just so greedy, he just didn't really sort of think anything through. But it's interesting. The intelligence services did warn Sarah Ferguson off Steve Wyatt because of his connections with foreign powers, and he was kind of sent packing. And so, why didn't Andrew get warnings about what he was doing? I quote a guy called Tim Riley, ex-Kroll, now teaching at Cambridge, who talks about the Russians having kompromat on him. And if people like that are prepared to talk openly in public with their names, one wonders, how many other people knew what was there and what they felt about it.
You spoke in the book about this chap, John Mark Dougan. So John Mark Dougan was a former deputy in the sheriff's office who fled with incriminating tapes to Russia. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, the Mark Dougan case is very interesting. Mark Dougan was, as you say, a Palm Beach policeman. He was actually passed these tapes, which had been basically recovered in the raids on the Epstein properties, by a man called Ricari, who was a very well-respected police officer in Palm Beach, who died in mysterious circumstances at a very young age, shortly after, during this period. And Ricari's line was, this stuff is going to disappear, so I'm giving it to you for safekeeping. Now, Dougan has passed this stuff up. It's in secret locations, he says, with instructions that if something happens to him, that it'll be released. But one of the weird things is he went for some reason to Russia. There were stories leaked to the Sunday Times by the intelligence services that he had got connected with sort of Putin's right-hand man. Now, some people say this is disinformation. It's not true. It's to discredit Dougan. Others say that Dougan, for whatever reason, kind of switched sides. But there is this material that the Russians have, and it's interesting that they haven't chosen to do nothing with it. And this is material that was picked up 20 years ago. So, there are a lot of people who know a lot, but we just, clearly we aren't hearing what the story is. And unfortunately, time and time again, when I do my research, someone will say, no one will talk to you. No one will talk to you. Some have talked to me, but a lot of people I'd hoped would talk to me are still not talking.
You mentioned in the book that there was a financial relationship between Andrew and Ghislaine, and that they did deals together. How extensive were their deals together, and what did you uncover about that side of their relationship?
There was one called Cynthia Matthews who was the source, and I just need to find more people like Cynthia Matthews who may have been involved. But they were all sort of slightly on the make, looking to make a quick buck, even though they had plenty of money, all these people. So I think the story is certainly they were doing some stuff in Malawi, some stuff in Thailand. And this is where, if some of these diplomats would talk, one might be able to discover more about what was going on. But I suspect that Ghislaine was being shoehorned into some of these meetings when he was a trade envoy, because there were some business opportunities there for her personally. But we just need more of Ghislaine's friends to talk, or indeed Ghislaine to talk more, shall we say, honestly than she's talked so far. I mean, she's been proven in her own trial to have lied. I don't think anyone believes the testimony she gave the other day to Trump's lawyer. So the question is, can we trust anything that Ghislaine tells us?
And Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House in America, has come out this week and said that Trump was an FBI informant who was helping to bring Epstein down or something along those kind of lines. Can you just explain what's happened there, Mike Johnson, and what your take is on that?
Well, I think it's rubbish. I mean, I think this is an attempt to sort of whitewash Trump, and Johnson is one of his strongest allies. And indeed, I think there's been some recent research showing that a lot of these people, heavy Republican donors like John Paulson and others, are all connected with Johnson. I think he's also supported Johnson. They're all connected. All the people who are trying to shut down the Epstein inquiry, or bankrolling what's going on at the moment, seem to have very strong connections with Epstein. So I think a lot of wild things have been said to try and sort of, present Trump in the best possible light when we know, he was best buddies with Epstein. And as you were saying earlier, I mean, best buddies with Andrew, despite the fact that he's denying it. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of meetings and pictures of them together. So everyone is trying to sort of distance themselves from the story. But the problem is it's all out there. And there are some people, fortunately, prepared to speak. So, as quickly as they try and clear up the mess, other bits appear elsewhere.
Andrew has been accused of many things, but intellectual curiosity is not among them. What's your take on the defense that he was just interested in Epstein's clever friends? So, for example, in the book, you talk about the fact that it was kind of brief that he was going on a date with this brain surgeon and this neurosurgeon. Is that just part of a kind of PR attempt from his end, do you think?
Yes, I mean there is something interesting that a lot of the women, that Andrew was involved with were very bright women, and you wonder what they're doing there. But when I asked people, they said, well, he was a British prince, and if you're an American, that's very attractive to have some connection. A lot of models and actresses, for example, who kind of threw themselves at him, clearly their careers prospered as a result of that connection. So, there were good reasons to be associated with him, even though he's a bit of a buffoon. Um, but one of the ways that Epstein got respectability was to support science and to give money, for example, to Harvard. He got Gates on board and Gates, of course, is another name that's often thrown around with the stories of Epstein. But get people like Gates on board. He got well-known scientists, John Brockman, who was a great sort of literary agent for scientists, and supported conferences. And this was a great sort of cover for him that, here he was entertaining serious people, trying to do his best for sort of science. And he was very interested in extending, people being able to live longer, being able to sort of cut off their heads and store them and bring them back. And, some really weird scientific ideas. So there were these scientists around, and there was this woman called Melanie Walker whose, I think, university fees Epstein helped pay, which he did for a lot of women. Clearly a very, very good scientist. And I think she went to work for Gates, and she did work on Epstein's foundation. And she seems to be the woman to entertain Andrew at one of these places, possibly at the ranch in New Mexico, or possibly on the island. It's not entirely clear. And the line that he puts out, the line that she puts out, is they were just friends talking science. But that's conventional line. Whenever Andrew, was caught canoodling with a woman, he would say, they were discussing books or history or whatever it was. Which is not, as you say, intellectual curiosity is not something that immediately comes to mind with him. He was always going to Libya, he claimed, to look at the antiquities. So there are, again, a lot of these people who've never spoken before. There's a woman called Emmy Taylor who worked for Epstein, who've just kept very quiet.
What did you uncover about Epstein and Andrew that surprised you the most and that wasn't common knowledge?
What surprised me about the relationship was the relationship went on much longer than people realized. I think it was a much closer relationship. I mean, for example, the suite of rooms that Andrew had at the Manhattan townhouse was called the Britannia Suite. I think the fact that Andrew was a regular visitor at Palm Beach, according to Deborah Gale. So the line from Andrew was he hardly knew Epstein and they were really business partners. And I think, discovering that there was much more evidence of Andrew at Epstein properties with young women, a much closer relationship. I think that to me was slightly surprising. I think the sums of money that Epstein gave Andrew to pay off Fergie's debts is a lot higher than I think everyone realized. The line has always been £15,000. I think I was told more like £2 million.
Give us a rundown of how things worked at Epstein's various places. So one of the things you mentioned a few times is these kind of photo books, which I guess were a kind of grim menu. And give us some idea of how this kind of process or how this setup worked as far as you understand it.
Well, several people have talked about these sort of photo books that were sort of like I suppose, like model cards, really, just which were passed around, I understand, on the island. I think Laura Burns uncovered these. I think they were recovered by the FBI. And that would be, I think, is one of the ways they were able to identify some of the victims. And so, Kobe Summers told me that Andrew had basically ordered Virginia off a catalogue. And that kind of rings true. I mean, the idea that Epstein would choose Andrew's type rather than, if he's got all these girls, why doesn't Andrew actually pick his own sort of take it away? Um, that does make sense, and that is pretty sort of is pretty shocking, really. That it's not that here's a little treat that I brought across for you as a bit of entertainment tonight, but here is someone that you've actually specifically chosen and has been flown out to meet you. I mean, then we are really talking about sex trafficking.
Why do you think the Met Police were so incurious?
Well, the Met Police, the commissioner wants their knighthood. They don't want to go down they don't want to go there. Often easier to turn a blind eye. I mean, people like Di Davis, head of Royal Security, were calling for investigations. I put in FOI requests about these investigations, which they refused to answer. They refused to say whether they'd even investigated Andrew. And I think Channel 4 put in requests. I think Virginia Giuffre put in requests. So those are questions I think that they have to answer. But I mean, just to get a sense of the sort of deference that goes on in British society, as an agent, had an author the other day who's writing about royal finances, a very respectable author, and he went to his regular publisher and said, would you be interested in this book? And he had high level, contacts. And the publisher said, no, we can't do this book because of royal sensitivities. And I said to him, does the head of the publishing house want a K? And he said, yeah, that's it. One just, it beggars belief to believe that people operate like that. But, there are plenty of people who spend their lifetime waiting to get some sort of honor, and, have no real moral boundaries, I'd say. So yeah, the police don't want to investigate it. No one wants to go down there, and we've seen it with various other cases. I mean, um, there was an American CIA woman who killed a boy in a motorbike accident, and again, the police wouldn't investigate because presumably pressure from the American embassy. I'm afraid, our legal system, which we think is brilliant, is pretty flawed.
Another thing that I found interesting from your book was that Charles lent Andrew part of the money to pay off Virginia Giuffre. I mean, I hadn't seen that reported in the press. The way it was always reported was that the Queen had stumped up the cash, but you talk about the fact that Charles had actually lent him some of the money for that.
That's what I was told, and that was really just as a shortfall while they sold the Swiss chalet, which I think he got 18 million for. So I mean, he had plenty of money to pay off Giuffre. I think the Queen paid the 2 million, which was the contribution to the charity, which doesn't seem to have been paid to the charity yet. And indeed, I saw the other day that even the 10 million hadn't been paid to Virginia Giuffre. I think when they were dealing with her estate, they found it actually hadn't arrived. So, I mean, there are disputes about the size of the money. I think I actually talk about it coming in installments from my source. Um, but yeah, it sounds like according to them, Charles had picked up picked up the tab so that he could pay it. And so the fact that such a large sum was paid, if it's true, and I think there's no reason why it shouldn't be true, because then one side would deny it, and that there were, for example, she only had a 1 year sort of period where she couldn't, a gagging order where she couldn't write a book, does suggest that she was in a very strong position. And it is interesting it's taken so long for Giuffre's book to come out, because that gagging order would have ended several years ago. She could easily have been writing the book while it was in effect. And it could have been the coup de grace several years ago. I mean, it may still be.
It was reported yesterday that Charles wants to have a crisis summit in Balmoral about Prince Andrew. Seems to me that the palace machinery is less inclined to protect Andrew now, especially since the late Queen died. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm slightly cynical about this. That story's been leaked to the press about the summit. And it gives the impression that they're doing something and there will be presumably there will be something that will emerge. But I judge people by their deeds rather than by their words. Uh, I think their attitude always is to never say anything and hope the problem goes away, to try through a mixture of patronage and pressure to basically kill stories, as they did with ABC, to leak stories to discredit people. For example, one of the things that my social media people have been talking about is the vast number of bots that have been used to give, for example, poor reviews to my book. Um, and they've switched off comments for that reason. I've never had a book which has had so many negative comments. We know that an Arab, or I've heard an Arab billionaire has been paid by the Yorks, or he himself has paid a PR firm to basically cause problems for me. So that suggests that's how they operate. They don't really. It's all below the surface. It's all briefings to people. This you can't take this person seriously as a historian. It's all made up. His sources are weak. We've all heard this before. I mean, there's a playbook that they play, and I've seen it not just with me but with other authors. So I'm pretty cynical that anything really will change. Only thing that will change is as soon as William comes to power, and if that's quite soon, I think he'll be much more ruthless. He sees the reputational damage Andrew and Ferguson have created, and I think he will force them to go into exile. He'll take away their titles and basically read them the riot act. But at the moment, while there's stupid people prepared to pay them to endorse products and to do business with them and to allow them to be middlemen and give them free gifts and let them test drive Land Rovers and give them jewelry, they're going to carry on.
Let me also ask you then, your book on Mountbatten was kind of groundbreaking and also turned out to be quite expensive for you. But what parallels do you see between the royal family's reaction to the allegations against Mountbatten and the royal family's reaction to the allegations about Andrew?
That's a very interesting question. The reaction to the Mountbatten was again just to diss the messenger. In fact, again, there were victims there, and there was no support for the victims. It was all about this couldn't have happened, and it's all made up, and these people are out trying to make money or whatever they were trying to do. And the mixture of that and saying nothing to see here, and basically trying to push the story under the carpet to get tame retainers to try and discredit the book or indeed the victims. And so it was only really with the Arthur Smith, who was an Australian victim who came forward the other day and has now got a case in the Belfast High Court, that more stuff emerged. But for example, Chris Moore, who's the former BBC correspondent in Ireland, has just done a book on Mountbatten and Kincora, and that book has been a bestseller in Ireland. It had absolutely no coverage in Britain. I tried to get the Mail to serialize it, for example. I mean, they had some pretty amazing revelations in it, including Arthur Smith, who hadn't been known about. And they didn't serialize it. So I think the British media will only go so far in terms of the criticism of the royal family. And we've got to remember, many of these proprietors are friends with members of the royal family. I mean, I even found my own publisher, a man running the publishing house, was very friendly with Sarah Ferguson, and indeed is publishing Sarah Ferguson. So it was only really having a pretty feisty editor who actually got this book onto her list and fought for basically no one else to see it. One of the extraordinary things I discovered was when I went in to sign copies, all the copies were in a locked room with only one person who had access to the key.
You also mentioned in the book the surprising amount of people who took the Fifth Amendment. Can you just give us a rundown of the amount of people that did do that, and also just explain why that is significant?
Yes, the Fifth Amendment is basically allows people in American courts to say, I'm not going to answer that question because it would basically incriminate me. or incriminate, the person you're asking about. So it's a get out of jail free card. I mean, anyone uses the Fifth Amendment, it generally does so because they clearly don't want to reveal the information. I've never quite understood it, but anyway, it's back there. And there were a lot of people, basically, all the way through the investigations into Epstein and the people around him. So I think one of the things where there were a lot of victims who then were kind of recruited to recruit other girls. And this is one of the accusations against Virginia Giuffre, that she, in some ways, traumatized woman that she was also part of the problem. But there were a whole series of people, say Adriana Ross, Sarah Kellen, and others, who gave the Fifth Amendment, and Epstein himself did. So the authorities didn't really get any answers, but it did. The question, for example, that Epstein said was the Fifth Amendment was when he was asked about Prince Andrew specifically. So this is why we didn't get any information about other girls with Andrew, I think, because lots of them were paid off. Lots of them had NDAs. They were frightened. I mean, I found with my researchers went out, for example, to Kazakhstan, people just wouldn't talk to them because Andrew still had very close links with the ruling families, and even members of staff who sign NDAs, who worked 30 years ago, wouldn't even tell me they worked for Andrew and Fergie. I mean, I think one of the really odd things was one member of staff who did talk to me told me that they actually Andrew and Sarah bugged the staff quarters so they could hear what gossip was going on. And therefore people didn't want to talk. But, the woman had been warned that, Andrew was a bit handsy and to watch him. And I think one member of staff had left. So there are plenty of stories about Andrew's inappropriate behavior. We don't need Virginia Giuffre to give testimony.